Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swamin Hite Namani.
22nd Avenue, the first temple in New York, there was a facility for Srila Prabhupada. He lived in an apartment in the back. But when the temple moved to 61 Second Avenue, which was really only 2 blocks up Second Avenue, and on the other side on the west side, there was no facility for him to stay. And so when he came through, he wasn't staying long in New York. He came from LA. He was on his way to either Europe or India, I forget what. But he was only staying in New York for 2 or 3 days. But there was no facility. So that was a problem. At the time, my childhood friend, high school friend, Jimmy Feldman, had just joined the temple. And I was living in Boston with my sister, visiting her at Boston University. And he was calling me or writing me, telling me I found this temple in the Lower East Side and the Hare Krishnas, and I'm going to join. So I came down for a quick visit to New York and visited with him, and he told me that the Guru was in town. And he was staying at his father's apartment. Jimmy Feldman's father, Joe Feldman, was a very wealthy man. They had a house out in Long Island where we lived, but he also kept an apartment in the city for business reasons. It was in the Beaux-Arts building on Tudor City Place near the United Nations. So Jimmy talked his father into letting Srila Prabhupada stay in that apartment for 2-3 days. So Jimmy said, I'm on my way over there. You know, he came out of we met down the street, and he said, walk me over to the temple. I had no idea who Prabhupada was, what was going on. So when we got to the apartment, there were devotees that were assembling there, and apparently Srila Prabhupada was in the living room and giving darshan, and people were congregating, not that many, there wasn't that many people in New York at the time, and assembling in the living room. And Jimmy came to the door, and I was with him, but I said, I can't stay, Jimmy, I'm going to just leave in a few minutes. And Prabhupada was about to begin speaking, and someone told Jimmy to come inside, and he wouldn't go in. He said, that's all right, I'll just stay here. And there was a little bit of a ruckus going on, a little bit of a commotion, because Jimmy refused to go inside the apartment. Even though it was his father's apartment, he didn't want to go mix with devotees. And I had no idea what was going on, but finally Srila Prabhupada said, what's the commotion? What's going on? What's the difficulty? And someone tried to explain that, well, Jimmy is feeling ashamed. He doesn't want, he smoked a cigarette that morning with me, and apparently he felt very ashamed to mix with the devotees. He said, I'm not worthy of being in the association. So Srila Prabhupada said, whatever you have done, I forgive you. Now come in and join us. Sit down. And I remember hearing that, and everybody went, Hari Bo, and it was wonderful, and he walked in, and then I walked out. I had to grab a ride to Boston that day. So that was the first time I ever glimpsed at Srila Prabhupada or had any experience with him. But it didn't make a real impact because I wasn't a devotee yet. I had joined about a month later, and then next time I saw Prabhupada was December.
So I finally made this connection with a very small temple of about 4 devotees in Baltimore. And I lived just 3 blocks away. So what I would do is I would wake up at 3:45 in the morning. And Baltimore was a little bit of a scary city at night. So I would run like a madman through the city of Baltimore to get to the temple. It was a little scary, but once I got there, I felt, great. It was wonderful. It was a very sweet group. Anyway, I heard a few weeks later that Prabhupada was coming to New York, to Henry Street. And they suddenly got that information that day. And so they said we had to drive all night to see Prabhupada during, Mangalarti. So we drove all night. I never really driven all night, but it was fun. It was great. We were excited, and I was excited to meet Prabhupada, and of course see another temple. I hadn't seen another temple, so I went to Henry Street, where Prabhupada was, and of course I had heard so much of Prabhupada. I heard so much of Prabhupada's voice on tapes, cassette tapes back then. And when Prabhupada came into the temple room, I mean, there was, it was a tremendous sort of, it's hard to describe. There was a kind of levity, to it. But while we were all kind of rising, we all went down when he came in. And I was struck at how short Prabhupada was, almost like a head shorter than me. And I'm not that tall, because Prabhupada always seemed so grand, larger than life, And I'm sure I'm not the only one who said this. This is because Prabhupada carried with him so much. The guru means, heavy. So the weight of the tradition you could feel being carried by Prabhupada. This attracted me a lot because I was here to learn. After all, I was a college student. I was seeking knowledge about yoga. So here, when I saw Prabhupada, I saw, here is a person the likes of whom I had never seen before, someone who carried with him the weight, the full weight of a tradition, powerful and beautiful tradition.
My first darshan I ever attended with Srila Prabhupada was in 1976. I had become the temple president in Miami, and I was only a 3-year devotee. And when I went to visit him, I didn't even know if I'd even get to see him or participate in a darshan, but I had a little book of photographs of what we were doing at that project. It was a pretty nifty project. We had ponds and swans and flower gardens. We were turning into a tropical paradise. And so Prabhupada was, when I got my chance to speak with him, which I didn't know was going to happen, it sort of took me by surprise. And Prabhupada opened the book, and very carefully, he was leafing through the book and looking at all the different pictures. And then he said to me, "So, you like to preach?" And I said, "Yes, Srila Prabhupada, I like preaching very much." And Prabhupada said, "So you develop this beautiful tropical paradise, and perhaps even others, and people will be attracted by the natural beauty of nature. And in that situation of being immersed in the beauty of Krishna's external energy, they will sort of open their hearts, and they become kind of vulnerable, if you will, or window opens." And he said, this is the perfect opportunity to enlighten them about spirituality and begin their spiritual life, sort of plant that devotional seed. So we did that in Miami, and then in time I was asked to come to Hawaii and develop projects there. And we've developed a beautiful project, which is now incredibly successful. Tour buses are coming by just to see the property, even from the outside, what to speak of those who come in. And when people come in, I'm always seeing as they go, wow, looking at this beauty. And they're like out of the box. And then we take that opportunity to start telling them about what inspired, because they're always asked, why did you develop this beautiful place? How did this happen? And I said, well, this is the instruction of my spiritual master, to develop this beautiful tropical paradise. And then tell people, really, what is the source of all this? Where did this beauty come from? And that's the opportunity to plant that seed and give them one of Srila Prabhupada's books and send them away and praying that their spiritual life will now begin.
A few days later is when I got initiated there in Boston. The story of my name, there's another good story, and this was told me by Brahmananda. So apparently the day before the initiation, which was December 26th, which was also the disappearance day of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and the day before, Brahmananda was speaking with Prabhupada and told him about me. He said, this young boy joined and he's my secretary, and I want him to get initiated. And I thought that we should name him Swarup Damodar, because Lord Chaitanya's secretary was Swarup Damodar, and he's been serving as my secretary. And this is what Brahmananda told me. Prabhupada looked at him and said, oh, so if he is Swarup Damodar, who are you, Lord Chaitanya? Does that make you Lord Chaitanya? And then Srila Prabhupada thought for a minute. He said, no, not Swarup Damodar, just Swarup. It's easier to remember. We'll just name him Swarup. And the famous phrase that sometimes people repeat this. The Prabhupada said Krishna consciousness is simple for the simple, but it's hard for the crooked. He said it that day. So when he was handing me my beads, I reached out for them, and he repeated it. He said, "So simple for the simple, difficult for the crooked." And then he handed me the beads, and he said, "So your name is Swarup Das."
But here's the thing, the morning classes were in some ways better than the morning walks, because the morning walks, the pathways were not big, so it kind of, I'd be in the third tier of humans behind Prabhupada, so I couldn't hear him so well, But the morning classes were wonderful. Now, I hate to say this, but the reason why the morning and evening classes were so intimate is because, frankly, most of the devotees got sick. Now, my wife at the time had volunteered to go into the kitchen. And she came back after a few hours in the kitchen and said, "We cannot eat this," because the Bengali boys were stomping potatoes on the ground and little worms were going into the food. And of course, later Prabhupada found out about this, and he was very upset with the devotee in charge of this, because Prabhupada noticed there were so few devotees attending class. But of course, that delighted me, because I just felt like I was one of the only few there, But it wasn't like so few. I mean, there were a good like 30, 40, devotees, but that's still very small when you spread out and so on. So on the day of Gaur Purnima, I had an experience of really one of the greatest surges of inspiration in my life. Prabhupada, I'm pretty sure he quoted this verse from the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Jayatam Surato Pangora, Mama Mandamadergati, Matsaraswapatambojo, Radha Madadamohano. And this so powerfully impacted me, that the lotus feet of Radha Madan Mohan are everything to me. Though I am lame and ill-advised and I'm senile, this is Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami speaking. Anyway, Prabhupada was speaking on this on the day of Gaur Purnima. I don't remember if it was the morning or the evening, but I was just transfixed. And of course, I was perfectly healthy, because once I heard what was being cooked, all I did was drink Dobbs and eat the little bananas. The little tiny bananas are ridiculous. You had to eat about 4 to get an American banana, So I was healthy, and I heard everything. I was alert, unlike most of the devotees. So this was just amazing. It was just marvelous. But that day, I actually felt like leaving and going back to America. Now, why would I want to do that? I was healthy. I was with Prabhupada morning and evening, this holy man like I've never known anywhere. Because I felt so powerfully that Prabhupada has given so much in the books. And not all the books were even out. Back then, just a few volumes of the Bhagavata, but TLC with teachings of Lord Chaitanya were out, and the Krishna books and so on. But I had this great inspiration with Prabhupada's books suddenly, with the books of the Vaishnava tradition. I had a sense, I had a special relationship with the great sacred texts of the Vaishnava tradition from hearing Prabhupada speak on this verse. So I, in a peculiar sort of paradoxical way, I felt like leaving Prabhupada, but in a way gaining more of Prabhupada and the tradition that he brought to the world. Just from that morning, that class. In many ways, moved me into the work that I've been doing up to this very day. Getting my PhD from Harvard and publishing sacred texts. I feel like I'm celebrating that moment. This very moment.
When we were giving Srila Prabhupada a tour of Bhaktivedanta Book Trust warehouse in Los Angeles, this is before the building on Higuera Street We had our facility in an old brick building on Washington Boulevard. And Srila Prabhupada arrived in LA and we gave him a tour. And as we were nearing the mail order area, the mail order department, Srila Prabhupada was asking questions about the subscriptions, how many letters were coming. And Tamal began saying, Srila Prabhupada, Swarup, he answers all the letters and he's writing to people all over the world. And he was giving me a promotion. And many people are joining and he's doing, getting a lot of success. And so Prabhupada looked at me and smiled and said, yes, one who has Swarup has liberation. And it was also at that time that I received a very, what I consider a very important instruction, personal instruction from Srila Prabhupada. The backstory is that just a few days prior, somebody suggested to me that I make up a form letter for the mail order department. In other words, people would write in, and if they didn't have any specific questions, they just wanted some information. We had already made a 4-color catalog. Instead of, just put a form letter in, my dear so-and-so, enclosed as a catalog, thank you for your interest, and that's it. And it just didn't sit right with me, a form letter. So, and I was pondering it over a couple of days. So when Prabhupada asked about the mail order and began telling him about this membership program and that I'd started in the mail, he began telling me that at one time he worked for Dr. Bose, and one of his duties was handling the mail. And he said that even if the smallest inquiry would come, I would answer personally and continue to correspond until they became a customer. So there was the answer to my question. There was no further thinking about form letters. No form letters. Everybody got a personal letter, even if it was one line. Can you tell me about Krishna consciousness? Can you tell me about Hare Krishna? They got a personal letter from me. But a lot of people joined from those letters. And we also had a membership program. In fact, just before coming here, I stopped at the temple over on Watsika, and I ran into 2 people who are mail order devotees, not mail order brides, mail order devotees. One was Jagadishananda, who, when I was writing to him, he was Johnny Gunn from Coon Rapids, Minnesota, and the other one was Ratnabhushana, and he joined with his brother, Manopriya, and they were Wayne and Mark Selzler, 1805 Assumption Drive, Bismarck, North Dakota. So a lot of people became devotees. And I like to think that I was working on commission back then, just acquiring or accruing sukriti. And unfortunately, all that credit was squandered. That sukriti credit was squandered by me over the years. I maxed out on those credit vouchers that I had from doing that service. I just felt very fortunate to have such a service. I mean, imagine going every day to your office, and all you're doing all day long is sending people books and magazines and preaching Krishna consciousness and answering their questions and finding out about them and having them join the movement. So it was a lot of fun, and we had great results.
When Srila Prabhupada was visiting us in Miami, and he was exiting the temple room, and as he was leaving the temple room, there's 2 exits. You could go out through the main exit, but Prabhupada decided to go out the side exit, which took him through the Tulsi room, where we had many Tulsi plants. At that time, I was a Tulsi Pujari, and I had built many pots, big wooden pots for Tulsi, and had set up ultraviolet lights. And Prabhupada walked through the Tulsi room. I was right with him, right by his side. And Prabhupada stopped. And he looked around at the Tulsis, and a beautiful smile came across his face, and he put his hands up in the air, and he said, "This is very nice." So, number one, it really invoked within my heart great appreciation of Prabhupada, recognizing my service and being happy with my service. But even furthermore, it deepened my relationship with Tulsi Devi. And since that time and to this very day, I take great joy and great pride in serving Srimati Tulsi because she is the mother of devotion.
One story about Srila Prabhupada stands out in my mind more than most, I suppose because of the gravity of the situation, what was happening at the time. And I'm referring to, this was December of 1973, when my sister, Manmohini's husband, Sridham, he met an untimely death, let's just say. And Srila Prabhupada was in LA. He had heard what happened. And maybe it was a week after, she and I went to speak with him in his quarters upstairs in the LA temple. And she had questions about her situation and her future. I mean, she was only 25. She had a 2-year-old daughter, and now she found herself widowed and wanted to know, could she ever get remarried? She had questions, and valid. So I went with her, and we spoke with Srila Prabhupada. And that afternoon, actually, Srila Prabhupada spoke on such a wide range of subjects. And I only wish that there was a tape recorder running at the time, and there wasn't. So I've tried to retain intact everything that was said. But one thing in particular was when he began talking about Sridham. Sridham was Prabhupada's personal servant for some time in LA when the temple was on La Cienega. So I think it was back in '68. So Srila Prabhupada began to speak about Sridham as if like to give a eulogy. And he was saying, so he was a good boy, Sridham, he was my servant. He was driving me. At the time, Sridham had a convertible that he joined the movement with. And so he would drive Prabhupada around LA in this convertible. And he said he was driving me, he was cooking, he was giving massage. And one day he asked if he wanted to get married. He asked me if he could get married. And I told him, you're still young, maybe better you should wait. But he insisted, and I let him. And then he went crazy. This is how Srila Prabhupada was recalling Sridham. Then he paused, and then he said, so we know from Bhagavad Gita, Krishna gives assurance that one who is on the path of bhakti, on the path of enlightenment, if he falls down, he'll be given again opportunity in the next life. This is given in the Bhagavad Gita assurance. How did Prabhupada put it? He will be born in a big family of yogis, Brahmins, or aristocratic family where there's no impediments. So he'll be given again the opportunity to make progress on this path and finish his business. And Prabhupada paused again, and he said, but he had the opportunity in this life, and now he has to take another birth. So what is the use? So what is the use? And those words struck me like a thunderbolt. And it dawned on me that, I mean, Srila Prabhupada cared so much about us. He did not want to see us taking more births and suffer. I mean, it says that the pure devotee, his only unhappiness is seeing the unhappiness of others. And so it pained him. I mean, his mission was to deliver everyone back to Godhead, what to speak of his beloved disciples. So when he saw us falling down and falling away and wasting the most valuable opportunity, it broke his heart. And so he didn't say it out of disgust, so what is the use? He said it out of compassion. Like, why? Why waste this valuable opportunity? And so that was stayed with me and continues. I think about that all the time.
During that 1974 Mayapur festival, like I mentioned earlier, it was a small group. Wasn't that many. Bhagavatam class, morning and evening, morning and evening. So Prabhupada was giving a class in the morning, I remember. And I remember he was going on for some time. Prabhupada's classes were generally not that long. He was going on for a while. And the deities, the altar was it? Oh, it was not open. The curtains were not open. But I decided to take my camera down to the other end of the temple room and take a shot of the whole event, you know, the Vyasasana and the devotees there and the beautiful, you know, you could see out the greenery from the different sides of the building. And suddenly Prabhupada stopped class, and I think the curtains opened, and all the devotees got up, and Prabhupada was coming right toward me, and I was right there, and I kept, and I'm not a photographer, but I sort of became one. And you know, photographers tend to be obnoxious. I mean, they get in the way, they kind of move around, they disrupt the reality of the situation a lot. Well, I sort of did that. And that's just not like me, you know? So, you know, I mean, Vishaka or Yadav, they're better at doing that kind. They have that obnoxious sort of photographic talent. Whereas I just had my little camera and I kept shooting, and Prabhupada was coming right toward me, but he was looking at Radha Madhava. And I was so sort of stunned by being within the vision, the visual range of Krishna to Prabhupada and Prabhupada to Krishna. I was sort of in the middle, and I was experiencing something of the sort that I've never really experienced, something really, truly ecstatic. And then Prabhupada came right up to me. I was in the way, as I mentioned, but between the railing and where Prabhupada, he's supposed to be at the railing. I was at the railing and not quite knowing what to do, and Prabhupada's just still looking at the deity. And then he got down to offer obeisance, and so I did, and our shoulders were touching. I didn't know whether this was inappropriate or whatever, but all I could tell you is I was thrilled offering, obeisance with Prabhupada, in unison. Really a thrilling moment. The whole thing was thrilling. I know that the other devotees were wondering, why are you there? Who are you? Should you even exist? How dare you get in the way of this extraordinary embodiment of the Vaishnava tradition? During that time when Prabhupada was walking up to Radha Madhava and sort of being within this sort of how do we say in photography, depth of field. I like that term, depth of field. I felt the depth to some degree. I felt the depth. And so much of yoga, as I had been studying all those years, was about being purely transfixed and attentive to the object of meditation on the outside, but internalizing it completely on the inside and being totally absorbed in it everywhere. That's what I felt when Prabhupada was walking up to the deities. I had a taste of samadhi. Not deserving of it, but I snuck into a little bit of samadhi there.
1976 summertime was the very first Rath Yatra festival in New York City. And Srila Prabhupada was there. The temple was on West 55th Street. And I don't know how it came about, but I ended up being the driver that day. We rented a very fancy Lincoln Town car, dark blue, black land out top. And I drove Srila Prabhupada from the temple on West 55th to the parade, which was already in progress. It had begun, I think it was on Central Park South, on Fifth Avenue, making its way down Fifth Avenue all the way to the end. And so my job was to get Srila Prabhupada in front of Subhadra's cart. Then they would stop the parade. Srila Prabhupada would get out of the car, climb onto the cart, and stay there for the rest of the procession. So on the way to the parade, let's see, in the car was, I was driving, Tamal was sitting next to me in the passenger seat, and in the back was Srila Prabhupada, I'm trying to remember, Brahmananda and Kirtanananda. Okay, that's who was in the car. And so Srila Prabhupada asked, as we pulled away from West 55th Street, he asked what's the plan for the day? And Kirtanananda said, Srila Prabhupada, we're going to drop you at the cart. And then at the end of the parade, at the end of Fifth Avenue, Washington Square Park is where we will have the festival. And there are booths there are tents, there's a stage set up where you'll be speaking from. We'll have kirtan, where we'll be distributing prasadam. So that's the way the day is planned. And Srila Prabhupada was listening, and I kept adjusting my rearview mirror to watch his expressions. And Tamal kept giving me dirty looks and saying, Swarup, watch the road, watch the road. And Prabhupada was quiet for a while, and then he began recalling how he said, in the beginning, in the early days, I used to go by myself to Tompkins Square Park, and I would chant, and very often the police would come and harass me. They would tell me to move or to stop chanting, that I was obstructing the pathway, or I was disturbing the peace. And so the police would make me stop. And so Kirtananda said, well, I think it was Brahmananda said, well, Srila Prabhupada, today the police will be there at the park, but they'll be there to make sure no one disturbs you, no one disturbs us. We have a permit. The park is ours all day long. And then I think it was Kirtananda said, well, Srila Prabhupada, I think it's safe to say that today you have conquered New York. And then I chimed in and I said, and Prabhupada, when you conquer New York, you've conquered the world. And Srila Prabhupada laughed and he said, yes, that was my thinking from the very start. Let me go to New York and start my mission there. It was the most important city in the world. So it was nice. It was nice that Prabhupada was thinking like that. You know, first they were throwing me out of the park, and now, you know, he was the main attraction.
At the very first festival that we had in Mayapur in 1974, I was a very young devotee. I'd only been a devotee for 1 year. And Srila Prabhupada was walking from greeting the deities down the aisle of devotees back to his Vyasasan. And I saw devotees. I was kind of looking down the aisle. Everybody was touching his feet as he went by. So as he got closer and closer, it was like my turn. And I reached out. I closed my eyes and I grabbed his feet. And I could feel it was just like velvet. They're the softest, most wonderful feeling. My hands were just like melting, like his feet were like melting like butter. It was just so sweet. And then all of a sudden it crossed my mind, wait a minute, I'm holding his feet. I'm stopping Prabhupada from moving. And then my heart started going real fast. I pulled my hands back and I kind of looked up sheepishly and I saw Prabhupada just was smiling at me, just like the moon was smiling. It was just such an expression of love. And I guess I understood from that Srila Prabhupada recognized what a neophyte, how I just didn't really know what I was doing and didn't mean any harm. But to encourage me, he gave me such a smile of love, and that really deepened my relationship with him.
On a morning walk with Srila Prabhupada in Vrindavan in India, this was August of Janmashtami time, 1974. I think it was Janmashtami morning. Anyway, it was very hot. Well, it's always hot in the summertime in Vrindavan. The flies were very, especially then, for some reason, very aggressive and just very intense and driving everyone nuts. So we were on this morning walk, and as the sun was coming up, it was getting hotter and hotter, and the flies were becoming more and more active. And finally, I got so frustrated and exasperated. I turned to Prabhupada and I said, Srila Prabhupada, are there flies in the spiritual world? And he said, yes, but they're not bothersome like these flies. And when they buzz, they're chanting Hare Krishna. So that was a good enough answer for me. I was able to tolerate the flies a little better after that. As soon as the words came out of my mouth, I felt like, oh my God, did I really just ask that question? Are there flies in the spiritual world? It was valid, and there are.
I went on a morning walk with Prabhupada. Now, in Dallas, the devotees there had an idea to take Prabhupada to a park, particularly beautiful park. So this would require getting in cars. We didn't just walk out of the temple complex and move along into a park, but we had to get into cars. So Prabhupada was in the first car with devotees. There was a second car, and there was a third car that I squeezed into. And it was dark out. It must have been in the winter or in that vicinity. And we got to the park and we pulled into the parking lot and we got out, and then you had to kind of walk a little bit in to the paths of the park. But there was a gate that was closed and said park closed, open at sunrise and closed at sunset. The devotees who arranged for this were like, And Prabhupada said, no problem. We'll walk up and down on the parking lot. So Prabhupada was so, appreciative and loving toward the devotees that he hardly wanted to make them feel badly for, frankly, not checking it out thoroughly enough. If you're going to take all that time and trouble to get in cars and go to a place, it's good to know whether it's open or not. But, back then there wasn't the internet where you could just check park times and everything is accessible. Where do you call, what do you do? So obviously, no one had checked it out. So there we were, about 20, 25 of us walking up and down a parking lot that would have a little bit of an incline. No one was in the parking lot except for our cars because everyone else was smart enough to know that the park was not open. So we would walk up and down. We'd go up the incline, and then Prabhupada would turn around, and we'd follow him back down. This would go on for 20, 30, 40 minutes. I don't know how long. And Prabhupada would be chanting, and we'd stop and talk sometimes. But the thing about the parking lot is, you heard Prabhupada's cane, because the parking lot was gravelly. So you could hear, that's pretty much all you could hear, plus Prabhupada's voice, or the devotees, doing their japa when Prabhupada was not talking. But the event that really stuck out, in my mind, is how a jogger was coming in the opposite direction. A man, I remember, he was wearing all white, shorts, whites, and he was jogging, and the jogger, who was going slowly, said, "Good morning," looking at Prabhupada. And Prabhupada said, "Good morning to you," something like that. And I remember looking at the devotees who were surprised that Prabhupada didn't say, something like Hare Krishna or, some kind of more sacred greeting of some kind. But what this reminded me of is how Prabhupada was a perfect gentleman. And that was how Prabhupada defined a devotee in that famous news interview down in Gainesville. How can you tell a devotee when you see a devotee? Prabhupada said, you will know by the fact that he is a perfect gentleman. And I'm assuming that he also meant a perfect lady as well. So that was a nice meditation.
What was supposed to be the grand opening of the Krishna Balaram Mandir in August of 1974. And I decided it was my turn to go to India. People had been going, the first wave of devotees went some years back, and people had gone to the Mayapur for Gaur Purnima the year before that. I had not yet made my initial trip to India, so I decided, all right, I'll go for this grand opening. And so the way I bought my ticket was LA, New York, then New York to India. But I decided I'll spend some days in New York. So while I was in New York waiting to board my next flight, I found out that Srila Prabhupada had arrived in Vrindavan, and he looked around and decided that the Krishna Balaram Mandir was not ready for a grand opening. The guest house wasn't finished. There was so much more construction that needed to be done. He called the festival off. But I was already in New York. I used the first part of my ticket. I figured, well, why not? Let me just go anyway. So off I went, and I arrived there in Vrindavan. It was a couple of days before Janmashtami. And it was nice because there weren't many people there. There was no festival. Otherwise, there would have been hundreds and hundreds of devotees there. So it translated into me having some more personal association with Srila Prabhupada. So, especially the fact that the first afternoon I was there, I happened to be standing outside of Srila Prabhupada's room as he came downstairs to give darshan. Every day he would have some darshan with the local people in Vrindavan. Palika came out of the kitchen or the pujari room with the garland and said, "Here, Swarup, give this to Srila Prabhupada." And already there were some elderly gentlemen sitting in the room, and Srila Prabhupada was sitting behind his desk, and they were talking. So I walked in, I put the garland on Srila Prabhupada, bowed down, gave my obeisances, and as I was walking out, Srila Prabhupada said, "No, you can stay, sit down." And so I sat against the back wall, and I just watched. I watched and observed how Srila Prabhupada was interacting with these gentlemen. I had no idea who was who. Maybe some were his godbrothers. They were just people he knew from Vrindavan when he was living there. They all seemed, they were Brijbasis, very, pious, wonderful, old elderly gentlemen. And most of the talking was in Hindi or Bengali. Actually, it was Bengali mostly, except now and then I'd hear a verse in Sanskrit that I'd recognize. And I noticed how Srila Prabhupada would go in and out. He'd be just joking with them, talking very casually, and then he would get serious and quote, a verse that I recognize from Srimad Bhagavatam or Bhagavad Gita. And I realized that although all of us, his disciples, we had so much awe and reverence for Srila Prabhupada, I mean, just the fact that he was so much older than us. We always refer to Prabhupada as our spiritual father, but in reality, he was more the age of our grandparents. As a matter of fact, coincidentally, Srila Prabhupada was born the same exact day as my maternal grandpa, Abe, September 1st, 1896. But what I was noticing in the room is that these were gentlemen of his age and his generation, but they gave so much respect for Srila Prabhupada. There was a friendly exchanges. I could tell they were like reminiscing, just joking and talking, casual talk. But they were giving so much respect to Srila Prabhupada and recognizing his stature, his status. And it was nice to see. I realized that Srila Prabhupada's reputation, who he was, did not go unnoticed among the Brijbasis, among his godbrothers, because even by then, by 1974, his accomplishments were phenomenal. It was 9 years into ISKCON, not even 8, from 66 to 74. And what he had accomplished in just those 8 years was unbelievable. He was conquering the world. He was like a transcendental Alexander the Great. And so when he went back to India with his dancing white elephants, it was, he was given this due respect, even by his old friends in Vrindavan. And it was nice to witness those exchanges in that room.
When I was in a darshan with Srila Prabhupada in Potomac, Maryland, 1976, when I was showing Srila Prabhupada pictures from our book and showing him our temple, Prabhupada asked me an unusual question I never expected him to ask. He said, "How many rooms are in the temple?" And very foolishly, without thinking, I'd have no idea where it came. I just blurted out, 13 rooms, Srila Prabhupada. And I said it very authoritatively. It must be the cheating propensity. But I just said that. Prabhupada nodded. And when I went back to the temple, I actually went through with a little notebook and I was noting down how many rooms there were. Little rooms you didn't think of, a laundry room, the bedroom, the closets, that, the other. And it ended up, there was exactly 13 rooms. So I suppose my realization was that that number 13 came from Supersoul. But the spiritual master and Supersoul, they're really, in a sense, one and the same. Jive sakshat nahi taite guru chaita rupe, shiksha guru hoy Krishna mahanta sarupe. So because we can't see Supersoul within, he comes without as the guru. So as a team, Prabhupada asked the question, and then the guru within inside, Supersoul, told me how many rooms it was, and everything turned out fine. But it was just a great realization how in touch Prabhupada is with Supersoul and how they work as a team.
Summer of 1971, Srila Prabhupada had arrived in Boston. He stayed in Boston for a while, then went to New York. So many people were initiated that summer. So many people had been joining. And so that was the time when reservations were made for him at a hotel, and he didn't want to go to the hotel. He ended up going back to the temple, although Swarup claimed there wasn't really any facility for him. But they made impromptu accommodations. They emptied out one of the rooms upstairs on the second floor for Srila Prabhupada. So that day was, I had my own vehicle. I drove up from New York. So Swarup asked me to pick up his luggage so they could just take Srila Prabhupada from the airport back to the, well, first to the hotel, but ended up going back to the temple. So I stayed behind and I gathered up his whatever luggage he had brought with him, his big steamer trunk that he traveled with. So I was about 20 minutes to a half hour behind everybody else who had already left the airport. So thinking everyone was going to be at that hotel, that's where I went. But nobody was at that hotel. And nobody called me because we didn't have cell phones back then. Wondering what was going on, I got into a phone booth, found out, no, come back to the temple, Prabhupada's staying at the temple. Okay, so by the time I got to the temple, and I brought the suitcases into the temple and brought them up the steps, and I knocked on the door, and I thought that there was going to be a whole room full of people, which there were when Srila Prabhupada first arrived. And I guess the darshan went on for about 20 minutes, a half hour, and then everybody left. So that's when I showed up on the scene. So I was a little taken aback when I knocked on the door and walked in, and nobody was in the room, except there was Srila Prabhupada sitting behind a table. And the room was bare because they had no time to really decorate it or do anything. Except there was one picture on the far wall, one of those Brijbasi posters, of baby Krishna, the butter thieves, with knocking over the butter and yogurt, and the crawling on the floor looking beautiful. And when I walked in, Srila Prabhupada was like this. He was resting his head in his hands. And I realized he was staring across the room at that picture, staring, gazing, lovingly. And I felt like, oh my God, I broke his samadhi. I walked in like this idiot. Again, Jerry Lewis, the bellboy. Like, where do you want your suit trunk, Srila Prabhupada? And, he acknowledged my presence, and I asked him where I should put his luggage. So he gracefully, with his finger, pointed to the wall. Said, "You can put it up against the wall." And like I say, it was very heavy, and I was clumsily walking across the room. And I realized after I put everything down and in place that I had entered the room and I had forgotten to offer my obeisances. So like a fool, I said, "Oh, whoops, sorry, Srila Prabhupada." I didn't know what to say, how to act. So I got in front of the table and I bowed down, and I'm going to Mama Vishnupadaya, and Prabhupada laughed and he said, "Thank you very much." He said, "Thank you very much." He was like waiting for me to, and then he thanked me for remembering so as not to commit an offense. Then he said, "Get up." And I got up on my knees, I was in front of him on my knees. And once again he said, "Swarup Das, I have given you a very nice name." And I said, "Yes, Srila Prabhupada, and thank you for he had just written me a letter a couple of weeks before that. I had gotten married in June of '71, and this was the next month. And after I got married, I sent Srila Prabhupada a donation of $50. My wife and I bought some sweaters, and he wrote me a very nice letter that said, "My dear Swarup, now you are married in Krishna consciousness. That is very nice, but marriage can be risky business because too much affection for the wife, the husband can forget Krishna. But if both husband and wife remember Krishna, household life becomes Vaikuntha." Then in the next paragraph he said, "In our line we have our perfect example of a householder, Bhaktivinoda Thakur." He said, "Such a nice householder he was, and such nice children he produced. One of them was my Guru Maharaj." So following the footsteps of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So I reminded Srila Prabhupada of what he said in the letter, and I asked him, I wanted to make a joke. I said, "Prabhupada, did you mean for me to have as many children as Bhaktivinoda Thakur? Did he have 10 or 11 children?" Prabhupada laughed and said, "No, in this age of," then he got serious. He said, "In this age, it's hard enough to support a wife and one child, two children the most." He said, "That's why I recommend 2 children, no more." So it was very nice to have that exchange with Srila Prabhupada. And I realized, and I asked him if he wanted me to set up his dictating equipment, the dictaphone. And he said, "No, it's late, I'm tired, I'll start working tomorrow." And I said, "Okay, well, Srila Prabhupada, if there's anything I can get you, anything I can do for you," I said, "All right, then good night." And I felt so stupid, so clumsy. We're told that the spirit soul is 1/10,000 the tip of a hair. And here I am feeling like 190 pounds of ignorance and clumsiness. But yet Srila Prabhupada is so, his presence and his association made me feel as light as 1/10,000 the tip of a hair. So I kind of floated on a cloud out of that room, feeling very wonderful to have that just little exchange, informal exchange with Srila Prabhupada.
Back in 1974, back at that first Mayapur festival, the first time when devotees from all around the world came to Mayapur. And the journey was divided up into 2-week portions. First 2 weeks in Mayapur, and then we would all go to Vrindavan, which also was a temple in progress. I mean, the temple, Krishna Balaram temple was simply, when you went there, it was simply columns rising into the sky of bricks, bricks and mortar. And but Prabhupada's quarters in the back were finished. So Prabhupada would stay there. We stayed a bit of about like a 5-10 minute walk down toward the center of Vrindavan in a place called Fogel Ashram, on the same side of the street, but about 5-10 minute walk down. So we would all settle there. And it was an ashram that had a kind of atrium open to the sky. And we all, were sleeping everywhere and so on. And I don't know, to this day, I can't even remember how it all worked. Because, I don't even remember where you showered or where you went to the bathroom or anything like that. All the practicals, it's inconceivable to me. That many people in this little ashram, anyway, how it worked, I have no idea. But every morning, Prabhupada would give class. And then they set up an asana, again, fairly high, in that atrium area, that open area. And it was beautiful. The weather was beautiful and very temperate. And we were under the stars, Prabhupada was giving class. And every morning I would hear Prabhupada. Again, most of the devotees were sick, so it was myself, and at that point, even more devotees were getting sick. And it was only like 15 of us, sort of semicircular around the asana, and well spaced. There's plenty of room. And if you got too close, you couldn't see Prabhupada as well. So you had to be a little spread out. So I was a good, 15, 20 feet from where Prabhupada was sitting. And there was only one person between me and Prabhupada, sort of in my line of vision. And so the class was going on. I remember it was just amazing just to sit there. I was well. I didn't get sick. And Prabhupada was looking over toward me. And then he looked over toward Brahmananda and said to Brahman, he said, "Brahmananda, what is he doing?" Pointing at me. So I thought, who else could he be pointing? He was literally looking at me, pointing at me. Brahmananda was asked, what is he doing? And Brahmananda looked over. I thought at me. And again, it was dark, so it was a little hard to see how everyone was exactly looking at things. But Brahmananda reported back to Prabhupada when he looked over, said, "Prabhupada, he is sleeping." Prabhupada said, "Go over there to him and tell him to go out, to leave." So Brahmananda, big Brahmananda, is walking over toward me. And I'm like wondering, was I asleep? I'm well, I'm rested. I'm like one of the only people in the whole group that actually can stay awake during class because I did not get sick. And here's Brahmananda coming over to me. While I thought I was listening to Prabhupada's class the whole time, I actually thought there was something wrong with me. And Brahmananda is coming over, he's coming over to me, and then suddenly stops at the person in front of me. Now, I didn't know that he was falling asleep. So suddenly, such great relief came over me that I was not the one to be told to leave. But then again, as I was reflecting a little later, I said, that was a wake-up call. So maybe I wasn't sleep, but maybe I was still asleep. in a certain way. I figured that was also meant for me. Wake up, Garuda. Wake up. Hear carefully. Pursue the process of Shravanam very, very carefully. Don't take it for granted, just like it's the first step, and then we can move on to the other 8 steps. No. Shravanam. It's all about Shravanam, hearing.
One anecdotal story comes to mind when Srila Prabhupada was in Boston, again, Boston Temple. This was also in 1969, the time I was initiated. So many devotees had come from the East Coast temples up from D.C. And there wasn't that many. At that time, I think there was only maybe a dozen centers in all of ISKCON. It was still pretty small in '69. Anyway, somebody was making oatmeal in the morning for all the devotees there, and apparently they mistook the salt for the sugar, and thinking they were putting sugar in, sweetening it, they ended up pouring a bunch of salt into it and ruining the whole thing. And so everybody had to wait for breakfast to be recooked. Anyway, word got back to Srila Prabhupada what had happened, and he made this comment. He said, just like in the process of bhakti and Krishna consciousness, a little sense gratification is all right to make it palatable. But just like in a preparation, a little salt to make the preparation palatable, but too much and the whole thing is ruined. So he gave that example that the salt was like sense gratification in Krishna consciousness. We're allowed to enjoy somewhat, to make it livable, make it doable for us, but too much and it's all ruined. So that was the salt example, the analogy. Metaphors be with you.
I often hear devotees saying that, geez, I hope I'm going to make it. I'm not sure if I'm going to go back to Godhead in this lifetime. I often ask the question, well, do you chant 16 rounds? Yes. Do you follow the principles? Yes. Are you doing some service? Yes. Are you staying in association with devotees? Well, I always remember back, one time when Srila Prabhupada came to the temple in Maryland, and I had the honor of being there. And at the end of the class, I don't remember everything Prabhupada talked about, but he concluded, as he does so often, he said, simply chant your rounds, follow the 4 regular principles, and at the end of this life, you'll go back home, back to Godhead. I remember that so clearly in my mind. I can literally see Prabhupada right now, and those words just coming out of his lotus mouth. And I always share that with devotees, that we can take Prabhupada at his word. Prabhupada wasn't exaggerating. Prabhupada wasn't bluffing. If we simply follow his basic instructions, Prabhupada told us we're going to go back to home, back to Godhead at the end of this life. So if we do that, it's a simple process. We simply follow his instructions, then we can be assured, because Prabhupada told us so, that we'll attain all perfection and go back to the lotus feet of Krishna.
One morning there in Boston during that summer, Srila Prabhupada was getting ready to go on his morning walk, and the car that was gotten ready to take him, no one could find the keys. The keys were lost, and everybody was panicking. It was last minute. So keys just disappeared. So one of the guests, hippie guy, that was staying at the temple, said, look, I have a car, I don't mind. And so he pulled around the corner with his old VW Beetle, the old bug. It was all hippied out, and it was a mess. And Srila Prabhupada got in, and the first thing Srila Prabhupada did, I wasn't in the car, I wasn't there, but I was told that he ran his finger along the dashboard, which was just very dirty and dusty, like a drill sergeant with the white glove, And he said, he put his finger up and he said, everything should be cleansed. Everything belongs to Krishna. Everything should be clean. And I think the lesson there was, why, of course they had the car ready for Srila Prabhupada's walk, all cleaned, but everything should be clean, not just because the guru is getting into the car this morning. Everything belongs to Krishna. Everything should be cleaned, no matter whose it is, what it's being used for. So that was what Prabhupada was telling us that morning. Everything belongs to Krishna. And he would often say, cleanliness is next to godliness. We were supposed to be Brahmins. He was turning feral jungle animals into Vaishnava Brahmins. he was a miracle worker. Because that's what we were. No couth. Animals. Wild. Prabhupada used to say, he loved us even though we were unlovable. He loved us anyway.
In Philadelphia, 1975, or was it 76? Anyway, somewhere in there, Prabhupada came for Rath Yatra. And it was wonderful. I mean, Prabhupada had many morning walks. I sat in Prabhupada's room for hours, right on the edge of his desk, I mean, just a few feet away. And again, I never asked Prabhupada anything. We interacted with eyes, but, you know, I was more observing Prabhupada and the visitors that would come in or be brought in, or the devotees who would come from afar, you know, that kind of thing. It was wonderful. But when Prabhupada first came to Philadelphia, he was interviewed at the airport, the Philadelphia airport. And he was being interviewed by a female reporter with whom Prabhupada had many exchanges back and forth, and he was being questioned about women's participation. And Prabhupada was in his own way, and I was not there at the airport, but I remember being told what had transpired. And apparently the female reporter was left somewhat distraught, dissatisfied with what Prabhupada was saying, and that he appeared to favor men over women, or at least the philosophy did, or something of that nature. When Prabhupada arrived, he first immediately came into the temple to offer respects to the deity. Then he sat on the asana. Now I was there for that. And I was sitting right within just a few feet of Prabhupada in the asana. And Prabhupada was reflecting back on this interview, and you could tell he wasn't happy with it. And this is my perception. He seemed to feel a little sorry for the way it ended up. And he then wanted to set the record straight. He said, male or female, everyone on the transcendental platform is equal. There is no higher or lower. Yeah. Oh, he said everyone on the dancing platform. That's what he said. I always thought that was sort of cute, if I may say so, because, you know, in the Western world we have dancing platforms, I think. I don't know because I never danced until I became a devotee. It was the only reason to dance. Before that, there was no reason to dance. So he said on the dancing platform, everyone is equal. Yeah. I admired how Prabhupada felt like he had to sort of recapitulate and reconsider and reflect and maybe redo in some sense. He seemed concerned. Yeah, I liked that. He was thoughtful, deeply thoughtful. I liked that a lot.
One night in particular, I was sitting in that little room in Boston. It was like a closet, and it was very cold winter of 1970. And I was sitting there with my hat on and a pea coat. I remember like defrosting my fingers on a space heater to get going on Krishna book. We were also at the time doing Nectar Devotion, the 10 chapters of the second canto of Bhagavatam. So much, Prabhupada was giving us so much to work on. But Krishna book was his main priority. And I was thinking to myself, why is Srila Prabhupada want this Krishna book published? It was a summary study of the 10th canto, and one of the first things I ever read was, well, when I joined, there wasn't much literature. It was the abridged Gita and the original Bhagavatams that Prabhupada brought from India, those first 3 volumes of Canto 1. And I remember reading in the preface the instruction that one should not go to the 10th canto until they've read and realized the content of the first 9 cantos. So why is he producing these intimate stories about Krishna? But it dawned on me that in his infinite wisdom, he was in his war against impersonalism and voidism, and we had just begun saying that prayer in conjunction with the Namah Vishnu Padaya. Prabhupada gave us that prayer to say, Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nivashesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarane, appreciating the fact that Srila Prabhupada was delivering the Western countries from the disease of voidism and impersonalism. And we were all infected, even as devotees, with this impersonalism. In fact, one day a new devotee had just joined, and he said, through in Prabhupada's lectures, he's always ranting, going on about the impersonalists and the Mayavadis. I don't understand. Who are they? I said, they are us. We are them. I said, we have all have this impersonal conception before we joined, especially about into merging with the white light, and we're all one, this oneness. And even in India, they have these misconceptions of Brahman is the absolute, and Krishna is subordinate to Brahman. So Prabhupada is giving the world the personality of Godhead. So he wanted this Krishna book out on the streets in everyone's homes, so we know that Krishna is a person. These are his pastimes. This is what he looks like. This is how he spends his time. One time Prabhupada said, we can give you God's name, address, phone number, his parents' names, his friends. So in no uncertain terms, he was presenting the personality of Godhead, Krishna, with that Krishna book. And Krishna book came out at the end of 1970. And at the same time, the Radha Krishna London album was produced by George Harrison. And at the same time, George Harrison recorded My Sweet Lord, which was flooded the airwaves in the US and in Europe. And I call it the trifecta. Those 3 things, the Krishna book publication, the Radha Krishna album, London album, and My Sweet Lord, all came together around the end of 1970. And as I said before, I would be receiving the mail every day, so I could feel the pulse of how the movement was growing. And from those 3 things happening, it just took off. That's when ISKCON really started growing exponentially into the early 70s. And over the next couple of years, it was just expanded everywhere, all over the world, every continent. Farms were being opened up, restaurants, devotees were joining in the hundreds and thousands. But I remember that it was autumn, towards the end of 1970, all that was happening. Brahmananda came back from Japan with the Krishna book, and that was the first time big books were being distributed on Sankirtan. Yeah, they were doing it out in the West Coast. I think it was Balavanta and Keshava in San Francisco, and Karanu down in LA. You joined in LA, didn't you? No? Oh, okay. So anyway, yeah, the Krishna book was out on the street. Sometimes with the record, it was a double thing. The album, you get the album, you get the book. Get the book, you get the album.
So in 1975, Prabhupada came to Dallas, Texas, to the temple there on Gurley Street, I think. And back then, the temple room doesn't look anything like it looks now. When Tamal Krishna Goswami took over, I mean, he made it into truly a Vaikuntha atmosphere. Back then, it was what it was, a gym. And the only thing that didn't make it, that told you it was no longer a gym, is that at one end there was an altar. And on the other end, there was a Vyasasana for Prabhupada. It was rather high, too. A little too high in some ways. It seemed awkwardly high. But the rest was very, the rest of the building, the rest of that room was, it felt like a temple within a gym, a gymnasium. So it was kind of weird. But when Prabhupada came, I remember one evening, Prabhupada gave a class, and the class was very short, and Prabhupada just started chanting the Mahamantra. And broke out into kirtan, which didn't usually happen after a class. And this temple room, of course, was rather long. It was a gymnasium. So it's appropriate for running around. Well, in fact, that's what ended up happening. The devotees were so moved by Prabhupada's chanting that they would run down toward Prabhupada, and then they would run all the way across down to the deities, and back and forth it would go. And I was not in the marathon group of runners. I was observing this, and I was just looking at Prabhupada, chanting the Mahamantra, and realized that everything is there. I knew I didn't fully appreciate it, maybe not even very much partially appreciate it at the time, but I could tell there was so much more there for me to gain. And what I learned from that was that I could look forward to extraordinary journeys into the Mahamantra. And indeed, that has happened.
I never really asked Srila Prabhupada questions on morning walks. I got to go on many morning walks, especially in LA, because when I moved from New York, I had my own car. And in those days, I think I was the only householder with his own vehicle. So I would just drive down to the beach and join the walk. You know, I didn't have to ask anybody. One morning, and I would usually stay in the back, because I would see people just having their first experience on a walk, let them be up close with Srila Prabhupada. And besides, at the beach especially, you can't hear much what was being said. But this particular morning was at Cheviot Hills Park, and one godbrother who was having some difficulties in his personal life, I know that was happening, and he suddenly said, Srila Prabhupada, he asked many times people would ask questions, and he said, Srila Prabhupada, I know that I've read that the soul is eternal, but is there any possibility that Krishna can create a soul and then at some point in time or for some reason or other, it no longer exists. It's extinguished. He used the word extinguished. It just goes out of existence. Could that happen? Did that ever happen? Could that ever happen? Srila Prabhupada stopped walking, he looked at him, and I could see that Prabhupada's lip curl. And Prabhupada looked at all of us and said, have any of you read my books? And I asked this one devotee, have you read my books? Have you read Bhagavad Gita? What does it say? Can anyone tell me? What does it say in the Bhagavad Gita? And just the day before, well, a few days before that, I had been memorizing verses at the second canto, those verses especially from 12 to 22 about the nature of the soul. So I had it down in Sanskrit and English, so it was, I took the cue. So I said, yeah, Prabhupada, I know. Jayate mriyate vakadachin, nayam bhutva bhavitavana bhuya, jo, nitya shashvato yam parano, nahanyate hanyamane sarire. And then Prabhupada said, in English, I wrote for the soul, and then he interrupted me, and he continued. He said, so, what does that mean? And then the guy, the devotee said, so I guess the soul never dies. And Prabhupada said, yes. And then he stopped, he said one more time, read my books, everything is in my books.
So to share this realization, you have to bear with me for a moment, a little sort of preface. When I was a young man, 15 years old, one morning a police officer knocked on our door, and he came in and informed us that my father had died untimely in an accident at our summer home, and there was an explosion, and one moment he was there, one moment he was gone. Well, my family, everyone was devastated, and everyone was crying and crying, but for some reason I didn't cry. And days went by, I think it was about 3 or 4 days until the funeral. I never cried, but everyone was coming, was crying and crying. I never cried. As we were leaving the funeral and driving in the limousine, all of a sudden the tears just flowed like rivers out of my eyes. So I knew, and I had that realization, that understanding. In 1977, when Srila Prabhupada left us, I was a temple president. Had only been a president for just a few years, maybe 1 year. And when we got notice that Srila Prabhupada had left us, I called all the devotees into the temple room and had a kirtan, and devotees were all crying and crying. But I wasn't crying. For some reason, tears never came. I thought, well, okay, it's going to come. Because I knew when I was a child the experience of my father leaving. And this is really my real father. Prabhupada's like the ultimate father. I knew it was going to come. So days went by and days went by, and I was waiting. It never came. Years went by. Decades went by. And I'm wondering, why no tears? So my conclusion's probably two things going on. One is just my lack of love for Srila Prabhupada as a neophyte. But perhaps, and I hope this is true, and I'm sort of thinking this in my heart, is that unlike my father, my material father, Prabhupada never left us. And as I chant my japa in the morning, as I struggle to follow very strictly the principles, as I'm always speaking, I'm feeling that Prabhupada is always with me. There's not a moment in my life I don't feel Prabhupada's presence. So that was my realization, is that Prabhupada never ever left, and he's always with us, and that's wonderful.
Krishna Bowl came to Los Angeles in '74. It began in Dallas with the Dallas Gurukula. And the Gurukula teachers decided to do it to help the kids learn the Krishna book. They had them study chapter by chapter and then answer questions in the fashion that the quiz show of College Bowl was. So they actually had these boards set up with buzzers and a moderator to ask the questions, and teams, or 4 people each, were set up. Apparently even the adults in the Gurukula teachers in Dallas were taking part. So there was the kids game and then the adults. And then it started spreading to other centers, including LA. And in LA, we just took off with it. I remember Murli Vodna was the moderator, and he'd make up the questions, and the really fancy boards were built. And after the morning program in the old temple room, we would have our Krishna Bowl contests. And the community, the LA New Dwarka community, divided up into we had about 3 or 4 teams. Rameshwar and his brahmacharis. Then Jai Tirtha he was the head of one team with 3 others. And then there was the ragtag team of myself and Biragava, Chandan, and Shrudashrava. And we played Krishna Bowl every single morning. And apparently, then there was it even culminated with an all-star game in San Francisco during the San Francisco 74 Rath Yatra, where the Dallas All-Stars played against the LA All-Stars, which consisted of myself, Jai Tirtha, Rameshwar, I forget one other person, it might have been Kuvera. We lost to Dallas. They were the scholars, Anyway, apparently a month or 2 after that, Srila Prabhupada got word that this was going on. And it was spreading like to smaller temples everywhere, all of ISKCON. We're playing Krishna Bowl. And it was kind of nice because it gave us impetus to study the books. I had an advantage because I typed 90% of Krishna book, twice over, rough copy, final copy. So I knew a lot of the stories already in my head. Anyway, Prabhupada found out about Krishna Bowl, and he nipped it in the bud, as we used to say. He nipped it. He stopped it. Not that he was angry with it. He said it wasn't necessary, especially for the children in the Dallas Gurukula. He said they shouldn't have such distractions. It's not necessary. We should stop it. We shouldn't burden them. I think he said we shouldn't tax their brains with these unnecessary things. So that was the end of the Krishna Bowl. It was just yet another circumstance where we got carried away with something, where it wasn't a question of right or wrong, just like astrology. I brought up the point to somebody recently that I saw a quote from Prabhupada in a letter and also in a purport that devotees we don't deal with astrology. We're not interested in astrology. And he specifically gave the instruction to his disciples, do not go to see astrologers. Don't get involved in astrology. Don't bother with it. So this one person who came to the defense, he began arguing with me. He said, no, you're wrong. Astrology is not bogus. It's very bona fide. It's all over the Vedic scriptures, and it was used and during Christians. And I said, look, this is what's called a straw man argument, because I never said it was not bona fide. I never said it was bogus. I'm repeating, I put a quote on my Facebook, what Prabhupada wrote about astrology in a specific circumstance. He said, don't get distracted by this astrology. Besides which, in this age, how many people are really bona fide astrologers? So this person got all up in arms. So when I was telling him, look, don't come to me with your argument, these are words from Prabhupada. And it reminded me that Prabhupada would often do that. In fact, one time he was giving that verse out of the Bhagavad Gita, Namam Diskritino Mudha, where Krishna says, fools and rascals, don't worship me. They're mudhas, and Prabhupada was saying that unless one is a devotee, he can have no good qualities. And this one Indian man was saying, Swamiji, how you can be so harsh in judgment like that? How you can say things like this? And Prabhupada said, no, I am not saying. Krishna is saying. I have to say what Krishna says. It is not my opinion I'm giving. This is Krishna's words. So, take it up with him.
I think the most powerful attribute that Prabhupada, that impacted me from Prabhupada, I think was the very palpable sense that here was the embodiment of the parampara that had come together in Prabhupada that would impact the world, but that more specifically would empower me. And unexpectedly, I felt, this power coming into me. Not in a way, I was not one of these devotees who would like to imitate Prabhupada, his mannerisms, his language. No. But rather, he empowered me to be me. Not to be him. Prabhupada is Prabhupada. That position is taken permanently. But that he infused within me the sense that I have a little tiny role here. And he could empower that. And it was about finding my own devotional voice, my own teaching voice. He just, and I have a very different personality than Prabhupada. I'm not bold like Prabhupada was. I'm not, maybe as in some ways, Prabhupada could shock people with sometimes what he says. That's really not my personality to shock, But that doesn't matter. He infused in me the power to be more me in relation to Radha and Krishna. I think that's Guru. That's Guru. That's really Guru.
A godbrother told me this story. I didn't have personal experience of this, but when the first wave of devotees went to India, Srila Prabhupada gave instruction to go to his room at the Radha Damodar temple where he had been staying and straighten it up, clean it out. And so this one godbrother said that in cleaning the room, he came across a piece of paper. It was just folded up. It was like a memo pad. And on that front page, Prabhupada had written a couple of things, like a to-do list. And on the very top, it said, save the world from godlessness. So that was Srila Prabhupada's to-do. That was his agenda. I mean, my to-do list is, do a laundry and get an oil change today and pay my electric bill. Srila Prabhupada's to-do list was save the world from godlessness. So I always thought that was a nice story, cleaning out the Radha Damodar room for Srila Prabhupada.
Everyone in this world, materially, wants something from us. Even the mother, who is described as the closest reflection of true love in this world, even my mother, who loves me like crazy, wants something back. But when I met Srila Prabhupada, it was so clear all he wanted to do was give, simply to give. And all the infinite qualities that Srila Prabhupada manifests, his compassion, his love, his understanding, they're just, I couldn't pick a single quality to say that stands out in my mind, because they're all manifest somehow. And I feel so incredibly blessed and fortunate that somehow Mahaprabhu came and Srila Prabhupada became part of that mission and came to the Western world, got on that Jaladuta and bared everything that he had to do to come here in his mission. And somehow I was dragged to his lotus feet, and I'm forever grateful.
In considering or thinking about the qualities that most stand out or I most think of Srila Prabhupada, well, there's one quick story that really illustrates one quality of his, which is humility. One Rath Yatra, my grandson was staying with me, Kevala, and he was about 11 or 12. He came out from Honolulu, where he grew up, and he came, we were living in Santa Cruz, and I took him up to San Francisco Rath Yatra. On the way home, we were stuck in traffic, and he said something so revealing. He said, you know, Grandpa, I noticed in Honolulu there were many spiritual organizations, and it's always Swami this, or Yogi that, or Baba this or that. He said, but with the Hare Krishna, it's the Hare Krishna movement, not the Bhaktivedanta movement. That Prabhupada's like in the background. And I said, Kevala, you just, in a nutshell, explained the most important quality of a pure devotee. A genuine devotee isn't promoting himself. He's giving Krishna to the world, and he's in the background. In fact, when I was answering letters as the secretary of ISKCON, sometimes it happened more than a couple of times. Someone would say, in the books I keep reading that one should find a bona fide spiritual master. Where can I find one? Srila Prabhupada was so humble that he never wrote in any of those purports, I'm your guy, I am the bona fide spiritual master. He would write it in third person. And they would ask me, where can I find one? I said, well, the author of the book, he is the pure devotee. And, before I met Srila Prabhupada, it's not that I had a lot of experience with I saw the Maharishi on TV once, this transcendental meditation. I was familiar with gurus and yogis. But when I first saw Prabhupada, what really stood out was there was no ego there. They're so pure. Of course, he embodies all 26 qualities of a devotee, but his humbleness is so genuine. Here he is, this empowered acharya, who's in no time had followers all over the world, and was leading this gigantic spiritual movement. But Prabhupada never displayed any sort of self-promoting, egotistical. When you meet somebody, and right away the internal radar comes on, you can feel there's an ego there. They want to impress you, manipulate you, exploit you, use you. But with Prabhupada, you knew he just wanted to give you love of God. There was no exploitation. He didn't want anything from us. He just wanted to give us Krishna consciousness. He wanted to take us back to Godhead and see that we don't suffer anymore. Just humble, pure, loving, and compassionate. Sweetness.
Jai Anilo Premadana Karuna Prachu